Hello and welcome to Dig School, cross-curricular learning themed around archaeology. This session is exploring artefacts when we'll be looking at how ordinary finds can tell us about change. Key questions will be how can we identify finds, you'll be able to have a go at digging with dice, and we'll also look at how context analysis can tell us about change over time. So some of you will have been digging test pits over the last week as part of Dig Week, and you'll have found things. The important thing is to be able to identify what those things are. So first thing we'll do is have a look at some of the most common finds that turn up in test pits so you can get your eye in to identify those. So in your workbook there's a list of 10 finds, have a read through them, and then when you're ready have a look at each of the pictures and write down the letter of that picture matched up with the description in the sheet shown here. So I hope you managed to match the images up to the finds from those descriptions. Let's have a look through and see how you got on. So struck flint was F. Flint is a glassy stone, very fine glassy stone. When it's when flakes are struck off it, it gives a very sharp edge, which makes it fantastically useful for tools, especially in the time before metal was in use. And classically, you can identify a bit of flint that's been worked by humans from one that's just got broken some other way by the bulb of percussion. That's the point at which somebody hit a main block of flint to flake off the piece they wanted to remove. You can see the bulb of percussion is just outlined out. The really sharp bit is the impact point, and from that point the force radiates out through the flint. So struck flint always has these sort of ripples across it, and you can usually feel, if you run your thumb over it, you can feel the curve of the bulb of percussion. It's the oldest commonly surviving manufactured tools we have, and in this country worked flint goes back about 800,000 years to the time when humans were very first here. So they're the most commonly found prehistoric artefact, but they are still quite rare, so quite special if you get one of those in a test pit. They can go right up to modern day because people use flint in building even today, and then it often has to be knocked into shape. The next one is firecracker flint, that was H. Here it's flint again, it's the same stone, but it's been heated up really high, either through being put into very hot water or being put into a fire, or perhaps being put into a fire and then into a liquid. All of this causes thermal shock, which gives you those crazed cracks running across it, and also tends to discolour the flint, making it opaque rather than translucent. So it may be evidence of cooking or even brewing. Or possibly even saunas. Some people have suggested if you get large amounts of it, life in the prehistoric period could have been better than we sometimes might imagine it was. Dates for this, about 4000 BC up to perhaps the Roman period. Roman pottery, the next one, so that's I there. Roman pottery is mostly well made by professional potters. It's sort of bought at marketplace. It includes pots with quite fine-grained fabric, often either red or white. It has neat rims and relatively thin walls. It looks more modern than one might think, in fact. Often there's a different coloured paint on the surface, as you can see on a couple of the bits here. But it's never glazed. It doesn't have a glassy surface. It might be a bit sort of silk-type finish, but it's never a glassy glaze. Next one is medieval pottery, that's E. That's usually earthenware, right through from the end of the Roman period to the Tudor period. Pottery's earthenware, and very unusually glazed, never glazed before about 1000 AD, and very uncommonly glazed before 1300 AD, and not that common after that. And if there is a glassy glaze on it at all, it's a bit patchy and a bit mottled usually. Fabric's usually quite coarse-grained, much coarser-grained actually in the Roman pottery, and sometimes there's other bits like sand or shell that was put in it to stop it cracking. Generally, if there is a glaze, it doesn't extend on both sides of the pottery, just on one side. Then there's post-medieval pottery. Now this is much more commonly glazed, not always all over, but it's much more common. The glaze often isn't terribly well attached to the pottery, so it will often come off. And if you found a bit in a field, for example, which has been being knocked around, often the glaze may well have come off, which makes it look like often a bit of a modern flower pot. You can see here some examples where there's a glassy, reflective glaze in a dark brown colour. Sometimes the glaze is clear and the pottery looks red when you see through it, or whatever the background fabric was. The glazed red earthenwares that you can see here are the most common type of post-medieval pottery, but we get other examples, some of which are brown with yellow decoration on them. Sometimes we get tin glazed earthenwares, which are a lighter colour fabric with blue or coloured patterns painted on them, but hand painted. Clay tobacco pipes, another very common find, J there, used in Europe from the 16th century, when tobacco, of course, was first introduced to Europe from the Americas, became increasingly common over the next, well, ever since. And as a result of that, the earlier pipes tend to have very small bowls, and the bores, the holes in the stems, are quite thick. As technology improved, the bore holes get smaller, and as the price came down, the bowls get bigger. So you can date your clay pipe fragments broadly using those rules. Certainly by the 19th century, they're really common finds on sites. Sometimes they had very long stems, right the length of your arms sometimes. They broke very easily, so we find lots and lots of bits of them. There's been someone there who's been smoking. We even find them in fields. People were clearly smoking while they were working in the fields. Victorian pottery, factory-made, mass-produced in great quantities, so we tend to find a lot of it if people have been living anywhere near there. New technology enabled complicated patterns to be printed onto the pottery. It's much less common to find hand brush-painted designs, but these very complicated patterns like willow pattern plate, which is showing a sort of very popular Chinese design from an old Chinese story. Blue is a very popular colour then because the cobalt was able to withstand the very high firing temperatures and was quite a new technology after centuries and centuries when pottery tended to be brown or grey or yellow. Blue was a refreshing change. Mass produced, so it's affordable, so there's a lot of it. Plastic toys, I'm sure you recognise this. Plastic toys are made of polycarbonates, which is a new technology really at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century. Became increasingly common, particularly after the Second World War, when huge amounts of stuff is made from variations on plastic, including nylon that's used in artificial clothes. All sorts of things use this polycarbonate technology. It is the type site for our age. If we talk about the Stone Age, when what we find, the majority of what we find is made of stone, we're in the plastic age here. And then there's a couple of types of finds which are much more difficult to date. So glass you might think would be easy enough to recognise, but actually if it's been in the ground for any length of time, it starts to lose its transparency. The glass, which is made of sand, is kind of trying to turn itself back into sand, so it laminates and it becomes opaque, and it sometimes gets a shiny surface on it, which sometimes looks really pretty. It can sometimes look gold, it could sometimes look iridescent, and when it does that, it doesn't look like glass at all. If you hold it up to the light, though, you'll be able to just see a hint of seeing the light through it, and on this picture here, you can perhaps just see the finger of the person who's holding it behind the bit on the left-hand side there, if you look very closely, just to prove it really is glass. And then there's animal bone. Again, I expect you recognise this. It's the most durable evidence for diet in the past because vegetable matter doesn't tend to preserve very well. Difficult to date because a Victorian sheep bone looks pretty much like a Stone Age sheep bone. But one way we can sometimes date it is by how it's been butchered. So butchery involving a saw, like this bit has been, with a very straight edge, and sometimes you can actually see the saw marks along the cut edge. That only really comes in after about the 17th century. So if you get a bit with a straight sawn edge, it's probably relatively recent. So that's given you a chance to get your eye in. There's the answers, so you can check yours. And the next thing we'll be doing is thinking about actually what sort of finds you might have got from a test pit, and giving you a chance to make some finds of your own through digging with dice. So we'll have a short break, and while you're doing that, find yourself a dice. Okay, so welcome back to part 2. We'll be now looking at digging with dice. So if you've got a dice, if you look on pages 2 and 3 of your workbook, you'll see there's a game board there. So lay your workbook out flat, and you'll see it's laid out 100 squares from 1 to 100, and the idea is you throw the dice and then move the number of squares. Now, if you only move numbers 1 to 4, you'll make more finds because you'll have more goes. So ignore 5 and 6. You throw 5 and 6, just throw again until you get a number that's 4 or lower, and then move the number of squares. So start where it says start. If you throw 1, you move on to the first square. If there's a find of any sort described on that square, mark a cross on it. That's your first find. So say you threw 2 to start, you'd land on square 2. Plastic carrier bag, mark a cross on it, that's your first find. Throw again. If you throw 3, you land on square 5, green wine bottle glass, that's your second find. If you land on a square with an instruction on it, then do what the instruction says. So this says go back 2 spaces, that takes you back to square 2, another plastic bag. So you've now got 2 plastic bags. And you'll build up your finds as you go by throwing the dice all the way down the board, following the numbers backwards and forwards, collecting your finds until you get down to the natural at the very bottom of the board, like the very bottom of your test pit. Once you get past the 100, you're out, you're finished, that's your excavation done. Now, I hope you've enjoyed finding some finds. If you've had any special finds, then mark them with a star. Now, special finds are ones that are not made of pottery, or they're not made of plastic, or they're not made of stone. They're made of something special. They're a bit unusual. So, for example, the porcelain doll's head that's marked here, that's a bit of a special find. We'd call that a small find if we found it in a test pit excavation. So you've had a chance to make your finds, and you'll end up with a board that looks something like this. Everyone's collection of finds will be unique because the way the dice rolled will be different for everybody. And it's just like that with test pits. Every test pit produces a unique collection of finds. So what we do then is, because we've excavated the test pit in 10cm layers, we've got the finds are separated from different layers. In exactly the same way, on the game board that you've just been playing, your finds are in layers. So context 1 is the top row of squares, context 2 is the second row, context 3 is the third row, and so on. So what you can now do for each context is list what you found in it. So under pottery here, 3, as it happens on this particular playing of the game, wasn't any pottery in the top context, but there were some other finds. So there were those 2 plastic bags, that bit of green wine bottle glass, and so on. And on the next context down, there were 3 sherds of plain white glazed pottery, sawn cow rib, and some clay tobacco pipe stems. So what you can do from those finds is estimate a date range for that context. Now, to do that with the pottery, you'll need to download the Dig School Pottery Identification Guide from the website, and that'll give you a guide guidelines for the date of any pottery that you've collected, either in your real excavation or in your digging with dice game. So that'll enable you to give a date range. So the earliest of the date range is going to be the earliest possible date that anything was in that context, and the end of the date range is going to be the latest possible date it was. So work through all of your context and fill in that sheet on your workbook. If you have your own finds from the excavation, do the same for them. Once you've done that and filled in all the finds on your context record sheet, layer by layer, what you'll have done is exactly the same process that archaeologists will do when they'll send their pottery off to a specialist to be identified, they'll send their animal bone off to a specialist to be identified, they'll go through all the other finds, identify them, send them off to specialists if they need to be worked on, and then they'll compile all of that evidence together so that they can understand each context, each separate bit of the soil where the finds have come from. So here for the digging with dice finds, we can see here's those finds from those topped up couple of contexts. And the next thing to do then is just have a bit of a think about what those finds might be telling you about what was going on. So you've got your date range, so that top context number 1 there, dates to about 1950 to the present. Plastic carrier bags only really became widespread use really from the 60s and 70s onwards, almost later than that sometimes. But we've got the plastic bag, plastic bottle fragments, we've got the wine bottle and so on. So we know the date range, 1950, could be right up to the present day. We still use the same sorts of wine bottles. But what was going on? What can we say possibly? If you were a forensics officer investigating the scene of a crime, what would you be able to infer about what might have been going on from those finds? So have a quick think. We'll look at this a bit more in the next dig school. But just write down for now what you think might have been going on layer by layer. And then you'll be able to look back at that and see if you can see how what was going on was different at different times, or whether it stayed the same. So I hope you've enjoyed that session of Dig School. We've had a go at identifying finds. You've had a chance to get your eye in and look for some of the key characteristics that are present in some of our most commonly found finds. You've had a go at digging with dice, and I hope you enjoyed that. And we've also looked a little bit at this context analysis, how looking at finds layer by layer can tell us about change over time. So I hope you've enjoyed exploring with artifacts, and I hope that I'll see you at another Dig School again sometime soon.